Mishpachah. Welcome to another WarriorGroup.com video. We make these videos to provide source information to those seeking truth, so that all believers and followers of Yahweh Elohim may come to one accord based in truth. Yahweh Elohim is a designation of the Mighty One or deity of Yashra'al, who is ancient Israel, of which the Bible is derived. As always, we have restored the name of the Father Yahuwah from the inserted title Lord, and the designation of power to all or Elohim from the inserted title God. Yahuwah is the tetragrammaton or four abreed or Hebrew letters of Yud, He, Uau, He that appears almost 7,000 times in the Torah Tanakh, or the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. This is a three-part video series that will be on the validity of the New Testament. Is the New Testament presented by the Catholic Church true? Is it useful? Is it even scripture? The short answer is no. We will be using the same dating metaphor of the four historical strata from Section A of this video. We will also use the same citation system of Section A. If you have no idea what these are, please watch the first 5 minutes of Section A of this video. We will also provide primary sources, which are first-hand accounts of events, as well as secondary sources, which are scholarly sources commenting on the topic of primary sources. This is part 2 of the series, Is the New Testament True? And this is Section C of Paul and the Herodians, the truth of Paul's travels in Palestine. Subsection 3, Paul's last 2 trips to Palestine. Now that we have thoroughly covered Paul's first trip to Palestine in the early 40 CE and what really happened during that time, we can move on to his second trip and what happened roughly 14 years after the first trip. I know it's been a while, but we're just going to pick up where we left off. We have shown that Josephus manages to record most of the historical figures from the NT narrative. He records plainly HaMashiach, or the Messiah. We have Yochanan the Mercer, or John the Baptist. He records Yaakov Tzaddik, or James the Just. He records Shamaun Kafah, or Simon Peter. He has the whole sacerdotal family of Canaan, or Ananias, that ruled as the Sadducee chief priest, or the high priest. He's got the whole of the royal Herodian family recorded. Antiquities even records secondary figures in the NT, like Cornelius and Stephen, just not the way the NT presents them. In fact, all of these individuals are documented in history by Josephus from the granite layer of history, who lived in the region during the time, just not the way the NT sand layer presents them 300 years later. We have seen that all the other historians for that region and period use Josephus to validate their own accounts. If all the other people of the NT are recorded in the historical account of Josephus, one has to ask, why isn't Paul recorded by him as well? Paul was such a pivotal character of history, it makes no sense to exclude him, especially since Paul died well before Josephus and was closely tied to the Zealots that Josephus records in great detail. The fact is, Paul is recorded in Josephus, but just as in the case of much of the information from the NT, it is not as the Catholic Church advertises, and we will show this during Paul's alleged third trip to Palestine. But first, we will focus on Paul's second trip, which has some historical truth and involves Herod Agrippa II that started ruling in about 48 CE after the end of the Great Famine. Palestine was rampant with conflicts during this period, and Herod Agrippa II was in total control of the region overall after the death of his uncle Herod of Chalcis, from about 48 CE until 70 CE. But the real violence kicked up to a whole other level around the time Agrippa II instituted Ishmael, the son of Phabi, to the status of high priest in 58 CE. During this time in history, the wealthy Herodian high priests were plundering the poor Yashra'ali low priest, which saw its pinnacle a few years later when the righteous teacher, meaning Yaakov Tzaddik of the Nazarene or Ebionite Zealots, is murdered in 62 CE by the wicked priest, who is also known as Canaan ben Canaan, and the liar, who is also known as Paul or Saul of Tarsus. According to Paul himself, his second visit to Palestine did not occur until 14 years after the first trip. As always, we got to provide information for this. Our primary source for this information is Paul himself. In Galatians 2, we read, "Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem," meaning Jerusalem, "with Barnabas, or Barnabas, and took Titus," or he means Timothy, "with me also. And I went up by revelation." Keep this in mind. Paul says he goes up 14 years later by revelation. "And communicated to them that Besorah, or gospel, which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation." In this respect, he means the 12. "Lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in secretly to spy out our freedom, which we have in Mashiach Yahusha, that they might bring us into bondage." So we're thinking circumcision is bondage, and the Mashiach gives him freedom from such bondage. "To these," meaning these brothers who slipped in to inspect them, "we did not yield into subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the Besorah might continue with you." Now, what this means historically is that if Paul was even converted at all, it could have only happened in the period from 39 to 41 CE, as we've already shown. Then he goes back to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, 14 years later, anywhere from about 52 to 55 CE, by way of what he claims was a revelation with Barnabas and Timothy too, it seems. According to Paul himself, there were men from Jerusalem sent by Yaakov Siddiq to, or James the Just, to inspect their teachings that Paul saw as false brothers who tried to put them back in the bondage of the Torah by trying to place circumcision on those Gentiles that Paul had converted and freed. Paul says he did not yield to the leadership of the 12 at all, not even for an hour. Paul lets the reader know that the leadership in Jerusalem aren't anything special to him, and that he was on the same level as those who were recorded to be ruling over the 12 thrones in the resurrection. Our primary source for this, again, is Paul himself. Galatians 2, verse 6. "But of those who seem to be somewhat, whatever they were, it makes no matter to me. Elohim accepts no man's person, for those who seem to be esteemed contributed nothing to me." Paul states many times that he learns directly from his visions, or the Ruach, and not from any man, even though the whole purpose of the 12 was to teach everyone the true doctrine. They are also recorded in Chazun, or Revelation, as being the 12 chosen of the Lamb that will sit at his table and rule as the foundation of his kingdom. But apparently, they ain't nobody special to Paul. Verse 7. "But on the contrary, when they saw that the Besorah, or the gospel of the uncircumcision, was committed to me, as the Besorah, or the gospel of the circumcision, was to Kepha, for he that worked in Kepha, or Peter, to make him a Shuliach, or apostle, to the circumcised, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles." There is that doctrine again, a Torah for the Gentiles and a different one for the native born, which is totally not based in Torah at all. Paul also claims Kepha was sent by Yahusha to the circumcised, but that too is not what any version of the gospel account says. Verse 9. "And when Yaakov," meaning James, Kepha, or Cephas, and Yachanan, or John, who seemed to be pillars, he used the same designation, these men who seem to be something important. When these men who seem to be pillars perceived the favor that was given to me, they gave the right hands of fellowship to me and Barnabas, that we should go to the heathen and they to the circumcision." This is supposed to be the same chain of events in Acts 15, and we will see that while the account in Galatians is historically true, it is totally off doctrinally. Paul did go up to Jerusalem for his second trip about 55 CE, and it was indeed over the issue of circumcision. But Acts will give you the doctrinal truth of the situation, even if it is lying historically. So our primary source is in Acts here. Chapter 15, verse 1. And certain men which came down from Yahuda or Judea taught the brothers and said, unless you are circumcised after the manner of Musa or Moses, you cannot be saved. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they got to arguing and beefing over this. They, meaning those false brothers that snuck in, determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them, meaning Titus too, should go up to Jerusalem to the Shulakim or the apostles and elders about this question. So that was them, these false brothers, who determined that they were supposed to go up there. And being brought on their way by the assembly, meaning the assembly of the Essenes, Ebionites, or Nazarene, they brought them up there. They passed through Phoenicia and Shamaroon or Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles, and they caused great joy unto all the brothers. So we see clearly, Paul didn't have any revelation. He's lying again about his theology. Paul is honest about the history, though, because he did go up to Jerusalem sometime in the mid-50s CE. Not over one of his visions, as he claimed, though, but because he was summoned and brought there by the assembly of Jerusalem, led by Yaakov Siddiq, or James the Just, that he thinks of as false brothers. And we've already shown he doesn't think this leadership is anything important. So in chapter 15, same chapter, we have the conclusion of this whole thing. In verse 6, it reads, and the Shulakim, meaning the apostles, and elders came together to consider of this matter. And when there had been much disputing, just like Paul records, there was much arguing about this, Kepha, or Peter, rose up and said to them, men and brothers, you know that a good while ago Elohim made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the Besorah, or the gospel, and believe. And Elohim, which knows the hearts, bear them witness, giving them Ruach HaKadosh, or the set-apart spirit, even as he did to us, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. This whole thing is supposedly after the Messianic incident in Lydda, which we covered in the previous video, which included a man named Dorcas or a woman named Dorcas that Kepha had converted. And this also followed his vision where he meets the Gentile Cornelius, which we proved he had to be a Gentile. All of it was historically false when we actually studied the historical accounts, but the theology was dead on as to what was occurring at the time. Acts has the same Kepha that we showed demanding Agrippa I leave Jerusalem with his daughter Bernice. This was the king of Jerusalem in 43 CE because they were foreigners. They were Edomites. He demanded that they leave. But Acts now has him supporting foreigners and validating Paul in the mid-50s. But is yet later going to refuse to even eat with Gentiles that have not been circumcised. Our primary source for this, Paul again, Galatians 2, verse 11. But when Kepha had come to Antioch, he came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was at fault. For before that certain came from Yaakov, meaning James, he did eat with Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. Paul also clearly says Kepha was a part of the same group as those other circumcision, but he now says Kepha is somehow scared of them. What's more, he accuses Kepha of being a hypocrite that was at first eating with those who had not been converted, but then pulled away. Kepha, who so zealously took up for Paul and unconverted Gentiles in the book of Acts we just read, now shuns them in Paul's account. That's a little odd. The reason being, Paul is lying doctrinally. It is a historical truth that Kepha did not eat with those who did not convert, which obviously included being circumcised. This practice of separation was well known, and he spoke of it himself, recorded in Clement. Our primary source are the recognitions of Clement, separation from the unclean. But Kepha, most benignantly regarding me, meaning Clement, less happily that separation might cause me sorrow. He was worried about Clement's feelings. He says to me, It is not from pride, O Clement, that I do not eat with those who have not yet been purified, but I fear lest perhaps I should injure myself and do no good to them. Kafar believed that those who were not yet converted still had demons on them, and he was worried about pollution from these demons. That is why he did not eat with them at Antioch. It was not from pride, but out of concern for his ability to minister. The account given by Paul doesn't even give us what Kafar said in reply to his accusation, as if he just sat there and said nothing. Paul doesn't even record what anyone said, just as they were all wrong and Paul is supposedly right. Paul's own words is our primary source, Galatians 2:13. And the other Yehudi joined with him, meaning Kafar, in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas or Barnabas was also carried away with their hypocrisy. See, here's the reality here. Barnabas or Barnabas, who is also Tobi'Yahu or Matthew, split with Paul over the issue of him not wanting to fellowship with Yachanan Marcus or John Mark, that we will get to soon enough. But we clearly see that all the Yehudi, which included the 12 and the leadership at Jerusalem, are on one side and Paul of Tarsus is on another. Which side are you on? Because Rome chose Paul's side. Paul had to explain to the audience in Galatia why he was no longer accepted by the leadership in Jerusalem. And Paul makes the whole thing about them being ignorant to the true message of Hamashiach, and that they walk with for the man who they walk with for over a year. But he talks through his visions. So Paul thinks they're ignorant when they walk with him for a year, but Paul thinks he's got it because he has visions about him. We showed Kafar's opinion in his own words on these visions at the end of section 2b, but we'll leave that to the reader or the viewer to come to their own conclusion. Even after all of this, there will be people who will still ignore these facts and will claim Paul and all of his actions were justified. They do this from one verse. 2 Peter 3:16 is a verse that everyone uses to wash away everything Paul says and everything he does historically. As also in all his, meaning Paul's epistles or letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do also the other scriptures. Let us just put aside the fact that Kafar is recorded as calling any letter from Paul's scripture, which is historically impossible at that time, because Paul's letters were not considered scripture any more than any of the 12 Shilikim or apostles' own letters were. Scripture to them at this time in history was the Torah, Tanakh, or the OT only. And not even all of that they accepted. That's just a historical fact of that camp or sect. They didn't accept the entire Torah from the first century. Kafar doesn't just validate a single letter here. He says all Paul's letters, as in plural, are scripture. We also see the NT pushes this sentiment that only the unlearned or the unstable would even question Paul, and those who do so twist his words to their own destruction. That seems eerily familiar or similar to how Galatians records Paul's feelings about all the hypocrites and false brothers who had twisted the understanding of the man they were with for over a year, that they called the Messiah or Hamashiach, not Christos or Christus, but we leave that conclusion to the viewer. Consider the fact that there is no other witnesses or primary sources in the Bible or historically to support Paul besides Kafar's statement recorded in Acts 15 and this letter that is attributed to him. Just Kepha as the sole witness. But when we view Paul's account of his interaction with Kafar during the same time period over the same issue, they were on diametrically opposing sides. The historical truth is that the letter of 2 Peter is universally understood by scholars to be written after the historical Shimon Kafar or Simon Peter died, and is the one book they all agree was not written by the author to whom it is attributed. These are secondary sources for this. Brown Raymond, Introduction to the New Testament. The pseudonymity of 2 Peter is more certain than that of any other NT work. Bart Ehrtman. Evidence comes in the final book of the New Testament to be written, 2 Peter, a book that most critical scholars believe was not actually written by Peter, but by one of his followers pseudonymously. The typical church tradition is that Kafar, whom they call Peter, died anywhere from 65 to 68 CE, around the same time as Paul did, by way of Emperor Nero as he rampaged against the faithful of the original Catholic Church. Taking a look at the San-Lair Orthodox Church Father Jerome or Hieronymus that lived from 347 CE to 420 CE, we can see that even as early as the 4th century, no one really believed Kafar wrote 2 Peter, and that it was a known fact that Kafar went into Rome in the 2nd year of Claudius. A secondary source for this is Hieronymus, or Jerome's own words, De Viris Illustribus. Forgive me, I don't speak Latin. It means on illustrious men. It reads, Shamaun Kafar, or Simon Peter. Simon Peter, the son of John, from the village of Bethsaida in the province of Galilee, brother of Andrew the apostle, and himself chief of the apostles, which is, we know is a lie, after having been bishop of the assembly of Antioch. So he's supposed to be the bishop of the church of Antioch? Okay. And having preached to the dispersion of the Yehudi, the believers in circumcision, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, pushed on to Rome in the 2nd year of Claudius to overthrow Simon Magus. And he held the sacerdotal chair there for 25 years until the last, that is, the 14th year of Nero. At his hands, he received the crown, meaning the Stephen Nazar, of martyrdom, being nailed to the stake, or cross that they like to put in there, with his head towards the ground and his feet raised on high, asserting that he was unworthy to be crucified in the same manner as his master. He wrote 2 epistles, which are called Catholic, the second of which, on account of his difference from the first in style, is considered by many not to be by him. Jerome, who knew Abreed, Greek, and Latin, knew that Kafar did not write that letter called 2 Peter, and is proof that the church knew it nearly 2,000 years ago. Also, Kafar did not die after 26 years of ruling as bishop in Rome, and he certainly was not the leader of the 12, as we have more than proven already. There is no biblical or primary source of Kafar being a bishop or overseer of the assembly in Antioch. That was one of the key assemblies in Asia tied to Paul of Tarsus. Kafar did inspect it, which caused the fallout depicted in Galatians 2 that we just covered, but he was in no way in charge of it. Furthermore, Nero was emperor for 13 years and 8 months, not 14 years. But even if it just meant the last year of his reign in 68 CE, it is still an obvious lie that we will show clearly. We will show that Kafar died when he went to Rome chasing Shamaun HaMagi, or Simon the Magi, after the time of Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 CE. Since we know that he confronted Paul 14 years after his first trip, anywhere from about 52 to 55 CE, this means that anywhere in that time frame, Kafar was murdered in Rome. The church chronology is totally senseless, because if Kafar actually did die between 65 and 68 CE, as they propose, then that would mean that he had to die after Yaakov Sadiq or James the Just. But we know that isn't true, thanks to our granite layer source of Clement in his letter to the overseer or bishop of Yerushalayim. Clement's letter to Yaakov. Shamaun Kafar, or Simon Peter. Clement to Yaakov, the master, and the Mabakar of Mabakarat, or bishop of bishops, who rules Yerushalayim, the set-apart kahal of the Abrim, and the congregations everywhere. So this is the top dog. He's the #1 guy in charge. Excellently rounded by the providence of Yahweh, with the Zekanim and the attendants, and the rest of the brothers, shalom be always. He continues, be it known to you, my master, that Shamaun, or Simeon, who for the sake of true faith, I must tell you, he himself, by reason of his immense love towards men, having come as far as Rome, clearly and publicly testifying in opposition to the immoral one who withstood him, that there is to be a good king over all the world, while saving men by his Elohim-inspired doctrine, himself by violence exchanged this present existence for life. The immoral one is the term for Shimon HaMagi, or Simon the Magus, the Magi. Kafar died in confrontations with him when Simon the Magi fled Palestine to Rome. And as we have shown, the magician was connected to both top Roman officials, like his friend Felix, and the royal house of Herod, like his friend Agrippa I. The point here is that there's no way that Kafar could have died after Yaakov Siddiq or James the Just, because that meant Clement would have written a letter to a dead Yaakov to tell him that Kafar died. Kafar obviously died before Yaakov Siddiq in the mid-50s CE, which was before Yaakov Siddiq was martyred, just as Clement records, and the church has simply twisted the words of Kafar and his writings to fit their doctrines. Since the church has gone to such lengths to silence Kafar, we will continue to let his writings speak for himself of this exact topic in his letter to his leader and fellow brother in the faith, Yaakov Siddiq or James the Just. Our primary source is Kafar himself, Kafar to Yaakov, the master and Mabakar or bishop of the devoted congregation, under the Father of all, through Yahusha HaMashiach, wishes shalom always. So this is in chapter 2, misrepresentation of Kafar's doctrine. In order, therefore, that the like may also be to those among us as to these 70, give the scrolls of my preachings to our brothers, with the like mystery of initiation, that they may indoctrinate those who wish to take part in teaching. For if it be not so done, our word of truth will be rent into many opinions. And this I know, not as being a Nabi or a prophet, but as already seeing the beginning of this very evil. For some from among the Goyim have rejected my Torah observant preaching, attaching themselves to a certain Torahless and trifling preaching of the man who is my enemy. This means Paul of Tarsus. Kafar continues and he says, and these things some have attempted while I'm still alive, to transform my words by certain various interpretations in order to bring about the disillusion of the Torah. So they're trying to destroy the Torah. That's why they're doing this. As though I also myself were of such a mind, but did not freely proclaim it, which Yahweh forbid. For such a thing were to act in opposition to the Torah of Yahweh that was spoken by Musha, and was borne witness to by our master in respect of his ageless continuance. For thus he spoke, the skies and the earth will pass away, but one yud or one punctuation mark will in no wise pass from the Torah. And this he has said that all things might come to pass. But these men, professing, I know not how, to know my mind, undertake to explain my words, which they have heard of me more intelligently than I who spoke them, telling their Talmudim or their taught ones that this is my meaning, which indeed I never thought of. But if, while I'm still alive, they dare thus to misrepresent me, how much more will those who will come after me dare to do so? Kafar informed Yaakov or James to take his teachings and only give it to those who they initiated through their protocol that we've already shown to join the Essenes. The reason Kafar gives for this is because people were already twisting his words to mean many things and were following the Torahless or lawless one who was the enemy that the same text already identified as Paul. Kafar warned that if these liars were willing to twist his words while he was still alive, they were certain to do so after his death. This is evident in the way that Acts is lying historically, trying to use a known member of the 12 to give Paul street cred. How do we know this? Because Kafar is not mentioned at all in the history of Acts after this point. Either Acts doesn't know what happened to Kafar and the other 12, or it just doesn't care. Kafar's only purpose in that text, just as the rest of Acts, was to validate Paul of Tarsus. After Kafar defends Paul with this fraudulent event depicted earlier in Acts for the sole purpose of giving validation to him, Acts introduces Yaakov Siddiq as the ruler in Jerusalem for the first time over the issue of circumcision, and he also makes a ruling. This is recorded in book of Acts 15, verse 12. Then all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders Elohim had wrought among the Gentiles by them. And after they had held their peace, Yaakov, meaning James, answered, saying, Men and brothers, listen to me. Yaakov Sadiq has the authority in Jerusalem. He is the Mabaka of Mabakarat, or Bishop of Bishops, and commanded all to listen to him after this huge disturbance over the issue of circumcision as it pertained to Gentiles that were being discussed. Verse 14 reads, Shamaun, meaning Simeon, has declared how Elohim at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. Acts pours it on pretty thick here. Acts has the Gentiles being taken first, according to Yaakov, and what he was told by Kafar, who Paul records as them giving him the right hand of fellowship. Then Yaakov recites Amos as proof that Yahweh will gather Gentiles as well, which is totally Torah, but totally out of context. And then he finally gives his verdict on the matter as the leader in Jerusalem. Therefore, my ruling is this, that we do not trouble them which from among the Gentiles are turned to Elohim, but that we write to them that they abstain from pollution of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. For Mushah, or Moses, of old time, has in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Then it pleased the Shilikim, or the apostles, and the elders, with the whole assembly, to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, surnamed Barsabas, and Silas, chief men among the brothers. All right, now the first point here is that Acts cannot even keep its own lie straight, and prayerfully the viewers have noticed this as well. Yusuf Barsabas, or the Joseph that was surnamed Justus, was one of the two chief people that were approved candidates for the supposed election of the 12th member to replace Yehuda of Kerioth in Acts 1:23. As stated before, both Yusuf Barsabas and Matthias or Matthew, who were so important that they were considered to fill the vacant spot, are never seen in the historical account of Acts again after that all-important election. Now Acts has given us yet another Barsabas, but this guy is called Yahuda. As we have proven in section B of this video, Barnabas is none other than Yusuf Barnabas, who is the Tobi'Yahu that filled the 12th position in the group. Barsabas, surnamed Justus, was just an overwrite for Yaakov, surnamed Justus, and Yusuf Barsabas is just a play on the name Yusuf Barnabas. And Acts basically had him competing with another version of himself called Matthias for this last spot. Acts now has to get rid of some of these fake names and introduce and sends this Barsabas to Antioch with Silas, who was with Paul and also a Roman citizen we covered in section A. This Silas, if the viewer recalls, was the close friend and confidant of Herod Agrippa I, and they all came over into Palestine in about 41 CE as one big happy Herodian family when Claudius gave Agrippa I his throne. Next, we will point out that Yaakov gives a ruling as the leader, and Acts records it plain as day. But Acts doesn't seem to know much more about him. This ruling is very interesting as well, as it was very specific for the Gentiles to be able to integrate into the sect or camp, because Torah was being read everywhere, and many were zealous for the law. This seems to be more of Acts providing doctrinal truth, because it does seem that some type of edict or general command was issued historically, but no record of a separate fellowship for Gentiles is ever recorded anywhere. Yaakov, or James, was clear that they stay away from idols, fornications, things strangled, and from blood. This is eerily reminiscent of the nets of Belial in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we covered, except for the wealth, of course. But wealth is an idol too, so the theology is right there. When we take a deeper look at those commands given to the Gentiles so that they could begin to enter the assembly, we see a definitive Nazarene or Ebonite flavor here. Idols are easy enough to understand as anything placed on the same level or higher than Yahweh, and is commanded to avoid at all costs in Torah. Fornication means sexual and or spiritual immorality, which included worshiping any power other than Yahweh, polygamy, adultery, and divorce, as well for any other reason besides fornication. which are all commanded in Torah, except for the new Nazarene stipulations on marriage that cause some men to abstain from marriage altogether. Staying away from blood is simple enough too, and is also outlined in Torah. The issue of things strangled is key in this. We are claiming that this command means to stay away from any animal that has been killed, or in other words, dead flesh. And we will provide the reasoning for this. The word used for strangled things is Greek in origin and Strong's G4156, pnictus, pronounced pnictus. The root is from 4155, which means to choke, throttle, i.e. neuter correctly. An animal choked to death or strangled. Some versions or the Strong's translators will try to imply that this can be in reference to animals that are not fully bled out. But the text doesn't say that, and since we know that it was a historical fact that the Nazarenes abstained from eating meat, one could easily conclude through textual criticism that this was about dead flesh or animals that has been killed. Because otherwise, the command to stay away from blood makes absolutely no sense. Think about it. Why would you need to command people to stay away from all blood, and then an additional command to stay away from the blood within animals? That is needlessly redundant, but that is the logic of the NT. The region of Pella near Pereira was the Nabatean or Arabian-owned region that was friendly to the Messianic movement of the Nazarenes, as we have shown, and that region is still in Muslim control today. Even in the Arab Quran, one sees the impact of the edicts of Yaqub Siddiq in Jerusalem, and Muhammad repeats this edict almost verbatim. Primary source for this is in the Quran, 2172, 53, 16115. Abstain from swine flesh, blood, things immolated to an idol, and carrion. Well, carrion literally means dead flesh, which is congruent with the practice of the Nazarenes. Paul did not even adhere to these simple instructions that should have seemed like a victory to him after such a huge debate recorded in Acts. Nope. He later told people that it did not matter if you ate food offered to idols. Here are Paul's own words on the topic. 1 Corinthians 8. Now, as touching things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice to idols, which we were just talking about, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other Elohim but one. He continues with, but to us there is but one Elohim, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Master, Yahusha Mashiach, by whom are all things, and we by him. Howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge. For some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But meat, which may mean food, but we'll prove that he means meat in this context, does not condemn us to Elohim. For neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we do not eat are we the worse. Paul is crystal clear here. Only those who do not possess the knowledge that there is only one Elohim, the Father, and that are weak in conscience are defiled by eating things offered to idols. And he's specifically talking about meat here. Paul says that what you choose to eat doesn't help or hurt you. This is directly in opposition to the Torah Tanakh, though, as there was definitely a designation between clean and unclean food, and a person was definitely defiled by consuming something deemed unclean or unsanctified by Yahuwah. What's more funny is that Paul did not eat flesh according to his own words for fearing of causing his brothers to stumble. And this is how we know he was talking about meat specifically in that context. But take heed, unless by any means this freedom of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. There he goes again, talking about this freedom from Torah and his Christos or Christus that false brothers are trying to take from him. He continues and says, For if any man sees you, which has the knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, will not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Mashiach died. But when you sin so against the brothers and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Mashiach. Therefore, if meat makes my brother offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stands, or else I may make my brother offend. Now, there Paul goes again, talking about people being weak in faith or weak of conscience by abstaining from eating flesh, which is exactly what the Nazarenes practiced. Therefore, he said he chose not to eat flesh himself so that his weak brothers did not stumble. There's your context for the word food or meat in that whole passage. It is about flesh. The Nazarenes did not eat flesh, and he was pro-eating flesh, whatever it was. So, basically, Paul goes directly against the ruling of Yaakov Sadiq. And he tells others to defy the leader of the 12. Because they all admitted and said, yo, don't eat anything offered to idols. Don't eat flesh, as we said, carry on. Any meat offered to idols. Don't eat meat. And Paul is telling them, man, go ahead. I'm not going to eat it, but you know what I'm saying? You can go ahead and eat it, though. That is pure wickedness and double-mindedness. It's pure nonsense. So 14 years from his first visit, early in the early 40 CE, Paul leaves Jerusalem after this ruling to the Gentiles and goes on the road to set up the assembly in Antioch sometime in the mid-50 CE. Paul records Kepha visiting the assembly at Antioch after him, and Barnabas was summoned up to Jerusalem over the issue of circumcision, and Acts specifically marks this as the point that he and Barnabas split up. Don't take my word for it. Read Acts yourself. Chapter 15, verse 35. Paul also and Barnabas continued in Antioch teaching and preaching the word of the master, with many others also. And some days after Paul said to Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brothers in every city where we have preached the word of the master and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them Yachanan, whose surname was Marcus, but Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia and went not with them to the work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed separate from one another. And so Barnabas took Marcos and sailed to Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brothers to the favor of Elohim. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the assemblies. Now we're seeing the formation of the cracks between Paul and the 12 that is probably doctrinal truth here in Acts. Sometime in the early 50 CE, Tobi'Yahu or Barnabas wanted to bring Marcos or John Mark, but Paul didn't want him to come because he left them while they were doing missionary work in Pamphylia during the famine in 45 CE that we covered during Paul's first trip to Palestine. They had a huge fight, and Tobi'Yahu totally broke ties with Paul and took Marcos with him, while Paul took Silas, who was a known Roman citizen and best friend of Herod Agrippa I, with him. This wasn't about not eating with Gentiles. This was about Paul having no respect for the leadership at Jerusalem. Why did Marcos even separate from them, though, according to the account in Acts? Well, let's let Acts tell us why they separated. Chapter 12, verse 11. And when Kepha, meaning Peter, was come to himself, he said, now I know of a surety that the master has sent his Malach, messenger or angel, and has delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Yehudi. And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Miriam, the mother of Yachanan, whose surname was Marcus. There's John Mark right there. Where many were gathered together praying. According to Acts' own broken chronology, this is in 45 CE, when Herod of Chalcis has beheaded someone during the great famine and was hunting down the Nazarenes when Kepha was jailed. But a Malach or messenger freed him. Kepha went to the house of Yachanan, who was surnamed Marcos or John Mark, who is the brother of Jacob, according to Acts. So Acts just gave us basically another Yaakov, just like the NT does. There's two Yaakovs there, as we already discussed. The church tried to promote three later, but there was probably just two. Also, Acts has another Miriam, the wife of Zebedee, in the fairy tale narrative. This is like four now. But we propose that there were probably only two. The first was the mother of Yahusha and his four brothers, the wife of Yusuf, who was also known as Cleophas or Alphaeus, and the other was Miriam from Magdala, who was commonly known as Mary of Magdalene. We have shown that historically, this was indeed Herod of Chalcis killing Tobi'Yahu or Thomas Judas, who was also called Thaddeus in the Hellenized version, and also the brother of Hamashiach known as Yehuda or Jude, and is the author of the book of the same name. This is why Acts calls the mother of the executed Miriam, because this was more likely them coming together after Yehuda or Jude was killed rather than some other Yaakov. Do not forget also that Yochanan was supposed to be the one that Hamashiach had his mother adopt as he was being executed in the Gospel of John. So she was technically John Mark's mother too, according to the Gospel narrative. Acts has Kafah find everyone and then orders them to report to Yaakov Sadiq in Jerusalem, and this is the first time the NT ever mentions any of Yahusha's brothers being involved in any meaningful way in the entire narrative. But he isn't even mentioned as his brother, yet anyway. So this is what Kafah tells him. Verse 17. But he, Kafah, beckoning to them with the hand to hold their peace, declared to them how the master had brought him out of the prison. And he said, go show these things to Yaakov, meaning James, and to the brothers, meaning the Nazarenes or the Ebionites. And he departed and went into another place. The reason Acts records that Yochanan Marcos or John Mark left Paul and Barnabas was so that he could report to Yaakov Sadiq and the others what had happened, just as Kafah had told them all to do. Now, how do we know this was specifically when Paul and Barnabas was doing this service during the famine? Because Acts internal chronology tells you that too. This is the account of Acts. This is not some weird interpretation. This is what the book literally says. This is also another point in the timeline of Acts that completely falls apart. This is supposed to be during the time of the Great Famine that was between 44 and 48 CE, as we have proven. Acts dates this specifically to be around the time that a Yaakov was beheaded by order of a king named Herod. We've already shown that there was a Yaakov that was impaled, not beheaded during this time historically. But he was the son of Yehuda Gamala or Judas the Galilean that led a revolt at the time of the Roman taxes in 6 CE and was ultimately killed. The only recorded beheading from this group was that of Thaddeus, the brother of Yahusha, also known as Jude. He and the Yaakov, who was the son of Yehuda Gamala, were killed at this specific time by Herod of Chalcis in 45 CE. This, in of itself, is not really that serious, and Acts could have simply confused one Yaakov with the other son of Yehuda Gamala, and historically it isn't broken yet. But then Acts will give us more information and tells us that this particular King Herod died before the famine ended. Book of Acts 12:18. Now, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Kafah. And when Herod, the king, had sought for him and did not find him, he examined the keepers and commanded they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and lived there. And upon a set day, Herod arrived in a royal apparel, sat upon his throne, and made an oration to them. And immediately the Malach Yahweh, messenger or angel of Yah, smote him, meaning Herod the king, because he did not give the esteem to Elohim, and he was eaten of worms, and gave up the Ruach. But the word of Elohim grew and multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their service. This was the missionary work in the Great Famine. And took with them Yochanan or John, whose surname was Marcus or Mark. Acts just broke historically on a few levels here, and it will continue into the next chapter as well. First, Acts just killed this Herod around 45 CE during the famine. Herod of Chalcis did not die until 48 CE after the famine, and his kingdom was given to Agrippa II. So that totally rules him out as this Herod the king. When looking at the granite layer primary source of Josephus, we see exactly who this was supposed to be. Our primary source is Antiquities 19:8, 1 and 2. What other acts were done by Agrippa until his death, and after what manner he died. When Agrippa, meaning Agrippa I, had finished what I have above related at Bertus or Beirut, he removed to Tiberias, a city of Galilee. Now he was in great esteem among other kings. Accordingly, there came to him Antiochus, king of Comelina, Sampsabergantes, king of Emesa, and Coitus, who was king of Lesser Armenia, and Polemo, who was king of Pontus, as also Herod his brother, who was king of Chalcis. Historically, this was after Shamaun Kafar told Agrippa he needed to leave Jerusalem because he was a foreigner in 43 CE, as we have shown many times. Agrippa I moved to Galilee, where all the 12 and Hamashiach were from, and started causing problems. Maybe because of what Kafar did, but that is just speculation. We read further, now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Yehuda, meaning Roman Judea, he came into the city of Caesarea. There was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his, meaning Caesar's, safety, at which festival a great multitude was gotten together of the principal persons. This is the Herod that was chasing Kafar and lived in Caesarea, not the Herod who lived in Chalcis. This is even confirmed by the strange circumstances surrounding his death. On the second day of which shows he, meaning Agrippa I, put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. So basically, he was shining so bright people couldn't even look at him. And presently his flatterers cried out, and one from one place and another from another, though not for his good, that he was a deity. And that they added, be you merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced you only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own you as superior to mortal nature. Upon this, the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. But as he presently afterward looked up, he saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was the messenger of ill tidings, as it had once been the messenger of good tidings to him. Acts has kept the theology intact, just messed up the history as usual. On a specific day of a festival where people made vows for protection for Caesar, which was profane to the Nazarenes, as we've already shown, Herod Agrippa I put on a royal robes that were made with silver woven into it, so that he shone so brightly in the early morning sun, to the point where wealthy people or the principal men said they were going to worship him not only as a man, but as a deity. This is why Acts said that this Herod did not give esteem to Elohim, because along with everything else he was doing that was evil, this fool let people worship him as a deity. Agrippa I did not correct these people, and this led to him seeing a messenger, which is an angel in the Greek, that we knew was a sign of his coming death. Then he suffered for a few days with some kind of horrible stomach illness, and he died. This is the exact Herod that Acts is referring to, Herod Agrippa I, who died in 44 CE before the famine ended. So Acts is totally off historically because it has him dying after 45 CE. But we will continue with the reason Yachanan separated from Paul. As we have shown, Kafar ordered Yachanan and the others to go to Jerusalem when they were in Galilee. But when Paul and Barnabas returned from Jerusalem, they wanted to go into Pamphylia. So Yachanan left them to do what Kafar told him to do, and go see Jacob in Jerusalem. Acts tells you itself. Chapter 13, verse 13. Now when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga and Pamphylia, and Yachanan, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem or Jerusalem. This Yachanan, or John Mark, was just doing what Kafar told him, just as Acts tells the reader. Yet Paul thinks less of him for not continuing with them. Do you see it yet? Paul did not respect the leadership in Jerusalem according to Acts, and that is why him and Barnabas split. The NT makes the reader subconsciously choose a side in this conflict by giving you these little details. Barnabas or Mattatyahu took Yochanan or John Mark and continued to the 12 because they understood that they were the leadership. Mattatyahu or Barnabas was actually the new member of the 12, but Paul started to think that he was no less to them and stated as much as we have shown. Yochanan probably went and told on Paul for his sugary doctrines and how he was doing his own thing, but that is just more speculation. What we do know is that Jacob and the leadership sent people to check on Paul, and Paul thought they were false brothers sent to spy on his freedom from the Torah given to him by his visions from Christos. This is the context where Kepha inspects Paul's assembly, not Kepha's, which was in Antioch during the mid-50s CE, just after Paul's second trip to Jerusalem, when Paul calls them all hypocrites in Galatians 2. Prayerfully, these pieces are starting to fall in place for you. Acts only records Paul traveling outside of Palestine after his second visit in chapter 15. It is not recorded in the region again until he arrives for his third and last trip in 58 CE. Now we can move on to Paul's final trip to Jerusalem, which is mostly fantasy in the sand layer of Acts, but has a few real elements of doctrinal truth as well. As we have already claimed, when Agrippa II instituted Ishmael II, son of Phabi in 58 CE, the conflict increased between the Herodian Sadducees and the Pharisees, or high priests and the lower priests, and the popular men of the mob. So the Herodians eventually came together in council to stop these innovators or zealots in 60 CE, but they were already robbing the lower priests or the poor in 58 CE. Paul allegedly arrives in Palestine for his third time at the exact time when the violence kicked off in the city. Acts depicts him arriving with a small group, but we will show that Paul of Tarsus showed up with the Roman army. Paul goes back to Jerusalem for his last time dated in the NT narrative from 58 to 60 CE in the last 2 years of Antonius Felix functioning as the Roman procurator when he was replaced by Festus. Paul is then harassed by a high priest that Acts only identifies as a Canaan or Ananias. What Acts appears to be doing is trying to cover for Paul and the Herodians. Acts seemingly wants the reader to believe that this is the Canaan or Ananias, son of Nebetus, that was the high priest from about 49 CE to the start of Felix's run in 52 CE. All these twisting of names and misdirection seem senseless, but it's actually quite evident why they're doing this. The reason Acts needs you to think that it was him, even though Acts dates itself by informing of Festus replacing Felix, is because the only other Canaan or Ananias that was a high priest during that period was Canaan ben Canaan, or Ananias, son of Ananias, who was the one that we have shown was historically the wicked priest, who called the illegal Sanhedrin to murder the righteous teacher, who was historically Jacob Siddiq, or James the Just. The NT authors wanted a few degrees of separation between him and Paul for obvious reasons. Paul's third trip starts in chapter 21 of Acts with his group that are traveling around spreading his doctrine. Use of Barnabas or Mattatyahu is no longer with them and is never mentioned again in the historical document of Acts. Again, either the authors of Acts didn't know what happened to him or they didn't think it was important. And even Paul never mentions him after the disagreement in the mid-50 CE recorded in his letter to Galatians. This was the only one who would deal with him. But after Paul became a shliach or apostle of his own making, Barnabas is all but forgotten. Paul's new group that is devoid of any of the members from Jerusalem that were with him in the 40s comes into Palestine at the height of violence in 58 CE, which was just a few years after the beef between him and the leadership at Jerusalem in the mid-50 CE depicted in Galatians 2 and Acts 15. Acts 21 reveals these details. Now when we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand and sailed into Syria and landed at Tyre, for there the ship was to unlade her burden. And finding Talmudim, or taught ones or disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul through the Ruach that he should not go up to Jerusalem. As soon as Paul's group got to Palestine in 58 CE, Acts records that they are immediately warned not to go to Jerusalem. Keep in mind that Jacob Siddiq is ruling in Jerusalem at this time, So it seems odd that he would be in danger when the leader of the city is supposed to be his close ally. Verse 8, and the next day, we that were of Paul's company departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him. Now, we have 8 days after Paul's group arrived in Palestine, they went to Caesarea because they were warned not to go into Jerusalem. We also see that secret 7 again, mentioned only in Acts one time to introduce the fake Stephen, is now giving us another member called Philip. We continue with verse 10. And as we tarried there many days, there came down from Yehuda or Judea a certain prophet named Agabus. And when he had come to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his whole hands and feet and said, thus said Ruach HaKadosh, or the set apart spirit, so shall the Yehudi at Jerusalem bind the man that owns this girdle, and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. First of all, what is thus says the Ruach HaKadosh? That concept is pure Pauline Christianity and not found in Torah or any of the Nazarene writings anywhere. This theology is more NT nonsense, but we know that Paul says the Ruach talks to him all the time, so it's par for course for him. After hiding out in Caesarea for a long period of time, Acts has Paul being warned by the same Agabus who prophesied the great famine in chapter 11. This Agabus is not recorded anywhere else in the entire text and is not recorded anywhere in history. Only the later Orthodox church fathers have traditions about him, but nothing tangible from any granite or concrete primary sources. Whoever this Agabus was supposed to be, he was a false prophet anyway, because as we will soon show, Paul was not bound by the Yehudi and delivered to the Gentiles by those Yehudi who bound him. On the contrary, Paul was saved from the Yehudi that bound him by the Gentiles that he called for himself. So he actually delivered himself into the hands of the Gentiles so that he could live. We propose this guy Agabus is a fictional character and is pure Acts fantasy. But the doctrinal truth is real. It was dangerous for Paul on the Temple Mount at this time in 58 CE because, as we will also show, Paul was robbing the common people for the Herodians who were causing problems for their rule in 58 CE. The Sicarii men of war were going to kill Paul, like they were doing many Herodians and others at that time, and we will show the Sicarii were really Idumeans or Edomites as well. Continuing with the narrative in 21 of Acts, verse 12. And when we heard these things, both we and they of that place besought him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, what do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Master Yahusha. And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Master be done. And after those days, we took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. Those with Paul got tired of trying to convince him not to die. And Paul feels confident about his beliefs and says he is totally willing to die for them. Verse 17. And we were come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went with us to Yaakov, and all the elders were present. Acts says Paul was welcomed with open arms, and then they finally went to see the leader, Yaakov Siddiq. And when he had saluted them, he, meaning Paul, declared particularly what things Elohim had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they esteemed Yahuwah and said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands of Yehudi there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the Torah or the law. These are the zealots on the Temple Mount. And they are informed of you that you teach all the Yehudi which are among the Gentiles to forsake Mushah, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Therefore, what is it? The multitude will come together because they will hear that you have come. Paul immediately goes into a spiel about all his great work with the Gentiles, and Yaakov and the others give praise to Yah, but let him know that the people around here at that time were zealots. The Temple Mount was no place for people teaching against the Torah. This is the doctrinal truth within this fairy tale. It was dangerous for those who were not keeping the Torah then, especially commands like circumcision. And this also flies in the face of people who try to teach that Paul was talking to lost sheep of Yashra'al who were calling themselves Gentiles. Because wasn't circumcision for all the tribes of Yashra'al, not just the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom as well? But I digress. The point is, if Paul was righteous, why was he in danger there and not Yaakov Siddiq or James the Just? If they both believed the same, then the threat would have been the same for both of them. But Yaakov was ruling in Jerusalem at that time, and in no danger at all according to Acts. It is Paul who has to fear the people, only identified as Yehudi in the text. Therefore, do this that they say to you. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take them and purify yourself with them and pay for them, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things that were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the Torah. Yaakov seems to be trying to save Paul from death in the text by having him perform a vow of a Nazirite, which means to dedicate yourself to Yah, which would prove that he does keep the Torah, and all would see that what the people were saying about him must not have been true. He continues, meaning Yaakov continues, as touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Now, this is pure lies here. This implies that Yaakov Siddiq taught a different Torah for Gentiles than for native Yisrael. But as we have shown, this edict was just a part of their initiation phase to get clean. People would follow this and be able to get immersed and keep the other laws until they were fully initiated. There's nothing that supports this anywhere, and Paul doesn't even adhere to these rules anyway, recorded in his own writings, as we have already shown. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple, to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. More historical garbage. The Nazarenes or Essenes did not practice sacrifices and stopped them altogether on the Temple Mount, which was a huge conflict between this camp and the Herodians. But here we are to believe that Yaakov Siddiq, who was a lifelong vegetarian, virgin, and the leader of this group, now ordered sacrifices to be made for Paul and these others of the group? Nonsense. Paul then gives the people his account of his special vision, which, as we have shown in section B, has changed considerably over the 3 times it is recounted in the Acts narrative, and it basically witnesses against itself. So it seems the people thought that Paul might be a liar. Go figure. So Paul then goes before the Sanhedrin led by a Canaan or Ananias. Acts 24, verse 1. And after 5 days, Canaan Kuan Hagadol, or Ananias the high priest, descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. Historically, this could only be Canaan ben Canaan, or Ananias son of Ananias, because there is no other Ananias or Canaan during the time of Felix. Acts wants you to believe that this is Canaan ben Nebatus, or Ananias son of Nebatus, who was the high priest in the time of Cumanus, the Roman governor, from 49 to 52 CE. But this is supposed to happen by at least 60 CE according to Acts' own internal chronology, because it dates this to the exact time of Porcius Festus arriving, and he took over after Antonius Felix in 60 CE. Sephar Maasim, or Book of Acts 25. Now when Festus was coming to the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and chief of the Yehudi informed him against Paul and besought him. So, about the end of Felix's term as governor, from 58 to 60 CE, Paul was supposedly being accused by a high priest listed with the exact same name as the one who oversaw the execution of Yochanan and Mercer, or John the Baptist, HaMashiach, or the Messiah, Yehuda Gamala, or Judas Galilean, and Thaddeus, or Judas. We actually have the record of this list of high priests from history, and whoever this was had to be an individual appointed by Agrippa II, but it could not have been Canaan or Ananias, the son of Nebatus, but historically could have only been Ishmael, son of Phabi, that was appointed in 58 CE and was the Herodian high priest until 62 CE. So these are the high priests appointed by Herod Agrippa. This is a matter of public record. This is a secondary source, obviously, but this was recorded. You had Ishmael ben Phabi, ben Cadmius in 58 to 62, Joseph Cabby ben Simeon, 62 to 63, and Ananias ben Ananias, 63 CE. Also, Acts records Paul as having another one of his famous visions. Book of Acts 23, verse 11. And the night following, the master stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified of me in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also at Rome. So now Paul's vision are telling him to leave Palestine and go to Rome so he does not have to die for his faith. That's rather convenient, especially considering Paul was just so bold about saying, I'm good, I'm ready to go for this faith. All right, verse 12. And when it was day, certain of the Yehudi, this means the Sicarii, banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy. This is doctrinal truth here. The Sicarii men of war wanted him dead for sure. And as we have shown at this point in history, an Edomite is considered a Yehudi. So the Idumean Sicarii were just called Yehudi in general, just as the Herodian princess Drusilla and Paul also are. What does Acts record as Paul's solution to this issue? And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, Bring this young man to the chief captain, for he has certain things to tell him. Paul has a sister that Acts never names. It is our opinion because you would clearly see his Herodian heritage. But look at who calls the Gentiles. Paul does. He wasn't delivered to Gentiles by the people in Jerusalem. He delivered himself to the Gentiles for help. And then his vision of Christos told him to get out of there and go back to Rome. This Agabus listed in Acts was clearly a false prophet according to Acts itself. We continue. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me to him and prayed me to bring this young man to you who has something to say to you. And he said, the Yehudi, again meaning the Sicarii, have agreed to ask that you would bring down Paul tomorrow into the council as though they would investigate somewhat of him more exactly. But do not let them convince you, because more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from you. This is how you know that these were not Nazarenes or followers of Yaakov Siddiq or his brother Hamashiach, because we have shown that making oaths was strictly forbidden by their sect. And this was the historical Sicarii, whose name literally means assassins, and who were also identified as zealots, just not as the Nazarenes. Continue with the narrative. Verse 22. So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charge him, saying, See, you tell no man that you have shown these things to me. Paul's unnamed nephew now departs from the narrative, and the Romans are going to save Paul just as he asked them to. And he called him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, at the 3rd hour of the night. And provide them beasts that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe to Felix the governor. That is 470 Romans protecting Paul from 40 assassins or Sicarii. If one cannot see how this man has connections, we don't know what to say. Imagine if you and your nation were rebelling against an oppressive government that was foreign, and one of your own was protected by nearly 500 of the enemy soldiers. Then that same person was held in protective custody in that government's version of the White House for 2 years. This doesn't raise any red flags? All right. The chief captain writes a letter to the governor Felix in 58 CE about this Paul. And he wrote a letter after this manner. Verse 25. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, sends greetings. This man was taken of the Yehudi and should have been killed of them. Then I came with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Acts tells you straight out that the Romans saved Paul because he was one of their own. Who, verse 33, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before them. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was, and when he understood that he was of Cilicia. I will hear you, he said, when your accusers have come also. And he commanded him to be kept at Herod's palace. Acts has the Romans protecting Paul from the Yehudi that want him dead. and Felix places Paul in Herod's palace for 2 years until Antonius Felix is replaced by Porcius Festus in 60 CE. Keep in mind that Felix is married to the Herodian Drusilla because of his friend Shamma'un HaMagi, or Simon the Magi. The next 2 years, Acts claims that Paul is in Rome, is actually Paul in Palestine murdering Yaakov Sadiq, the Acts revisions as Paul killing some rando named Stephen. The NT goes so far as to remove Paul from the entire continent to establish this seemingly solid alibi. Now let us go to the granite layer primary source of Josephus and see what he has Paul doing from 58 to 64 CE, which is the last record we have outside of the NT of Paul's movements in the region. Antiquities 20:8. After Woodman and upon the death of Claudius, Nero succeeded the government, as also what barbarous things he did concerning the robbers, murderers, and impostors that arose while Felix and Festus were procurators of Yehuda. About this time, King Agrippa, meaning Agrippa II, gave the high priesthood to Ishmael, who was the son of Phabi. And now arose a sedition between the high priest and principal men of the multitude of Jerusalem. These principal men were obviously the Nazarenes, who were in charge during that time period. We read in line 181, and such was the impudence and boldness that had seized upon the high priest, meaning the Herodian high priest, that they had the hardness to send their servants, this means Paul and Costobarus, into the threshing floors, to take away those tithes that were due to the priest, meaning the lower priest, insomuch that it so fell out that the poorest, or Abunim, or Ebionites, sort of the priests, died for want. We are suggesting that the servants of the high priesthood were Costobarus and Saul, and one only needs to continue reading more of Josephus' writings for this to become crystal clear. When we read Wars 2:17, 4, 4:18, how the war of the Yehudi with the Romans begin, and concerning Manaheim. And as they said these things, they produced those priests that were skillful in the customs of their country, who made the report that all their forefathers had received the sacrifices from foreign nations. But still, not one of the innovators, meaning one of the Nazarenes, would hearken to what was said. Nay, those that ministered about the temple would not attend their divine service, but were preparing matters for the beginning of the war. The Nazarenes had control over the Temple Mount. They had forbidden sacrifices altogether. That the priesthood, the Herodian high priest, viewed this as them giving up their divine service. When we continue, so the men of power, meaning the Herodians, perceiving that the sedition or the Nazarene movement was too hard for them to subdue, and that the danger which would arise from the Romans would have come upon them first of all, endeavored to save themselves, and sent ambassadors, some to Florus, and the chief of which was Shamma'un, the son of Canaan, or Ananias, and others to Agrippa, among whom the most eminent were Saul, or Paul, and Antipas, and Costobarus, who were of the king's kindreds. They were related to Agrippa, and they desired of them both that they would come with an army to the city and cut off the seditious, or the rebellion, before it should become too hard to be subdued. There are your eminent men who were of the boldest sort. It is Paul and Costobarus who are the family members of Agrippa. Therefore, they were both part of the royal Herodian family. The lower priests were not making these offerings and detracted from the Herodians' position. The Florus mentioned here that was being petitioned for an army was Gessius Florus. He was the Roman procurator of Judea, or Yehuda, from 64 until 66 CE. This means that not only was Paul beating and robbing the Nazarenes after the death of Yaakov Sadiq and Kafah, he was doing it after he was supposedly converted, way back in the 40s, and just after Acts has him on his second 2-year stint of house arrest in Rome from 60 to 62 CE. That is pure fantasy, and the historical truth is that Paul rode into Jerusalem with an army to subdue the rest of Sicarii and take back the Temple Mount. Wait a minute, there's more. If you recall, this is also the same name of the individual that Acts listed as giving Paul his sight back after his alleged vision on the road to Damascus. Ananias, or Canaan, is the same guy who granted him his sight back. The troll is real, and prayerfully, people can see through the Roman Catholic Church's overrights and obvious lies. Because in the church's history, they don't even mention this family that ruled the high priesthood for most of the first century in Palestine. The sacerdotal family is not mentioned anywhere. It is well recorded historically that Paul died about 65 CE in front of Emperor Nero, which was 1 year after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. So that means these events listed in Josephus occurred in the first year that Florus was procurator in 64 CE, the same year of the fire, which Acts makes no mention of, just as it fails to mention the death of Yaakov, Kepha, and even Paul himself. The only death of the 12 recorded in the historical account of Acts of the Apostles is Yaakov, the brother of Yochanan, which we have already shown to be an obvious overwrite. The Acts of the Apostles has little to no information on any of the actual Shilikim or apostles, but it has a ton of information about Paul though. These Nazarenes, or later Ebionites, instituted many innovations that were problematic for the royal Herodian family, specifically, and with the rabbinical system that the Sadducees and Pharisees put in place. This is why the men of power were trying to reason with these zealots or innovators, because as the text stated, the Herodians would be hurt first. Why? Because Rome put them in power as tax farmers in the first place, as we have shown in section A. If these Herodians could not now keep the peace and keep collecting taxes, then Rome would simply replace them with people who could. The wealthy Herodian establishment gathered a council of these Sadducees and Pharisees who tried to convince these zealots, nationalistic innovators, that offerings for and from foreigners was totally fine. Although I have yet to see that in Torah, but it may have been something from traditions of the elders. In fact, Yechazkel or Ezekiel is quite clear on this particular topic. Primary source for this is the book of Ezekiel or Yechazkel 44, verse 6. And you shall say to the rebellious, indeed, of the house of Yashra'al, or ancient Israel, thus said Yahweh Elohim, not thus says the Ruach HaKadosh, thus says Yah, O you house of Yashra'al, let your hearts be filled with all your abominations or pollutions. That same terminology from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In that you are brought into my sanctuary foreigners, uncircumcised in the heart and uncircumcised in the flesh, to be in my sanctuary, to pollute it. Indeed, my house, where you offer my bread, the fat and the blood, and they have broken my covenant because of all of your abominations. See, what we had here was the only sect or camp that was actually Yehudi or Yashra'ali by birth, the Essenes or Ebionites. They were rejecting the foreign occupation of their land and temple. And this is the reason why the multitude was with them and also zealous for the Torah. The people knew exactly what was going on. The NT narratives, Paul of Tarsus, and the historical individual only listed as Saul or Saulus in both antiquities and wars are one and the same person. The passage naming Paul directly was from wars, which was written during the 70s, so not long after the Second Temple was destroyed by Titus. In the eyes of the Pharisee Josephus at that time, the Herodians are trying to save everyone. Josephus was close friends with Agrippa II, and even published a few of his letters in his works. This benevolent Herodian slant is laughable, of course, but when we look at his account in 20 years later in Antiquities, that was far removed from the violence of that time. Josephus is straight snitching. Antiquities 29 and 4. Concerning Albinus, under whose procuratorship Jacob or James was slain, as also what edifices were built by Agrippa. But Canaan, or Ananias, son of Ananias, was too hard for the rest by his riches, which enabled him to gain those that were most ready to receive. Keep that in mind, by his wealth, his riches. Costobarus also and Saulus, there's your Paul, did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family of Herodians. And so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to Agrippa, meaning Agrippa II. But still, they used violence with the people and were very ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. And from that time, it principally came to pass that our city was greatly disordered, and all the things grew worse and worse among us. Josephus outright informs the reader that these men of the Herodian family are wicked. There's also that rich or wealth designation again that we have seen and understood to be a trap of Shaitan at that time, or a net of Balial. The rich in the city were the Herodians, and they are looked at as benignly negligent at best in the language of the Gospels, but most do not know that this concept that the Gospels use of the wealthy being evil and is easily corrupted was originally Nazarite or Nazarene in origin. But the core of it eventually became the Ebionites or Abinim, which has all just been written over and redacted to the version we have left to us today. This is reflected in what Josephus knew about the Essenes. Wars 2:8-3-127. Archelaus' ethnarchy is reduced into a Roman province, the sedition of Yehuda Gamala or Judas Galilee, and the three sects. These men, meaning the Essenes, are despisers of riches, and so very communicative as raises your admirations. This account is also expressed within the Qumran corpus, specifically in the Habakkuk Peshar. This is where the Nazarenes or the Ebionites' hate for wealth came from, or where it's exemplified. Our primary source from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Habakkuk Peshar, or the commentaries on Habakkuk. The wicked priest became proud, and he deserted Elohim and betrayed the Torah because of his riches. He plundered and collected the riches of the men of violence, themselves rebels against Elohim, and took the riches of the people, multiplying upon himself in sinful guilt. This Canaan ben Canaan, or Ananias, son of Ananias, was rich, which was typical of the Herodians then. He collected money from the other men of violence of the boldest sort, which was Paul and the other Herodians, and then robbed the people of their wealth. This connection seems pretty clear in our opinion. Canaan ben Canaan was the wicked priest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was an establishment Herodian Sadducee and high priest, or chief priest, as we've already displayed. He was a wealthy Herodian aristocrat and was able to use that wealth to accomplish his goals. We see that Paul was directly related to Agrippa II, and thus is an Idumi or Idumean, which is an Edomite, from the Pharisees that probably even knew Josephus personally. The Herodians listed in Antiquities are all the same individuals from the account in his wars 20 years prior in the 70 CE. They're listed as good people, mostly at first, just told by Josephus, who probably feeling more secure at this time in the 90s, so he gives a little more information. In this later account, Josephus informs the reader that Cosabarus and Paul were not only related to King Agrippa II, who probably died in 92 CE before he wrote Antiquities, but also that these two Herodians were wicked men who robbed the lower priests that were still Yashraali or Israelites, just like in the case of Yochanan and Mercer's father, as we have shown in Section A. The men of war, who were the traders, were none other than the Sicarii Edomites, and they played a vital role during this time period. These Idumean Sicarii freed their fellow members that were held prisoner in the city and then killed the former Kohan Haggadol, or Canaan ben Canaan, or Ananias son of Ananias, and Yahusha ben Gamel, or Yeshua the son of Demonaeus, as well as the other wealthy Idumeans or Edomites that lived in the city. Primary source for this, Wars 4:4. The Idumeans being sent for by the Zealots came immediately to Jerusalem, and when they were excluded out of the city, they lay all night there. Yeshua, one of the high priests, makes a speech to them, and Simon the Idumean makes a reply to it. 270 reads, "Thus spoke Yeshua, yet did not the multitude of the Idumeans give any attention to what he said, but were in a rage." This is Yeshua ben Gamaliel, who in 63 BCE replaced Canaan ben Canaan, or Ananias son of Ananias, who only held the office for 3 months after he killed Yaakov Siddiq in 62 CE. Line 271 reads, "But Shamaun, or Simon, the son of Calthus, one of their commanders," this is in the city, mind you, "with much ado or effort, quieted the tumult of his own men, and stood that the high priest might hear him, and said as follows, I can no longer wonder that the patrons of liberty," he's talking about Sicarii zealots here, "are under custody in the temple, since there are those that shut the gates of our common city to their own nation." Let that sink in. This is an Edomite saying he shut the gates to the common city of their own nation. The general inside the gates, and thus the Herodian military, even understood that the Idumeans or Edomites were the same people as the people of the city. When the Idumeans wanted the military to throw down their weapons, many of them were insulted. Once they got inside, they wrecked their own people who were in control of the Temple Mount and freed their members who were in custody there. We read, and the Idumeans then fallen upon the city. But they first made all haste to get the zealots out of the city, which those that brought them in earnestly desired them to do. They came into the city for the purpose of freeing the Sicarii, and then persisted in slaughtering the wealthy Idumea or Edomite relatives, and eventually killed the high priesthood. This is what led to the war with Rome. Primary source for this is Wars 4:5, 1 through 2. The cruelty of the Idumeans when they were gotten into the temple during the storm, and of the zealots concerning the slaughter of Canaan or Ananias and Yeshua and Zacharias, and how the Idumeans retired home. Nor did the Idumeans spare anybody, for as they are naturally a most barbarous and bloody nation. But the rage of the Idumeans was not satiated by these slaughterings, but now betook themselves to the city and plundered every house and slew everyone they met. But they sought for the high priest. Remember, these are the high priesthood who killed Yaakov Sadiq. So that's when the Romans, or the Herodians, basically, they took over totally after they killed Yaakov Sadiq. They take over the Temple Mount and they imprison all the zealots they can capture, namely a lot of the Sicarii. We continue reading. As soon as they caught them, meaning the high priest, they slew them and stood upon their dead bodies in a way of jest, upbraided by Canaan and Ananias with his kindness to the people, and Yeshua with his speech made to them from the wall. These Idumeans were the robbers and assassins identified by Josephus, a part of the zealot movement, who were mad at the Herodians for slaughtering them in the past and under Herod I, and then being subjected to Roman rule. They killed all the wealthy Herodians and high priests, then desecrated their bodies and threw them over the wall. This is how you know they were not keeping Torah, because that is all unclean. The Sicarii tried to convert the other wealthy Idumeans in the city, but those Idumeans refused because they saw the Idumeans as killing their own nation. We continue. Now after these were slain, the zealots, meaning the Sicarii here, and the multitude of the Idumeans, meaning the Edomites, fell upon the people as upon a flock of profane animals and cut their throats. But for the noblemen and the youth, they first caught them and bound them. These are the noble Herodians, in hopes that some would turn over to their party, meaning the Sicarii. But none of them would comply with their desires. But all of them preferred death before being enrolled among such wicked wretches as acted against their own country. The Idumean Sicarii freed their members. They killed all the establishment high priests and the wealthy Herodians living in Jerusalem years after Yaakov Sadiq was murdered, and their fellow Sicarii were now imprisoned on the Temple Mount. This is why Yahshua HaMashiach and the others had to travel to the city during the festivals. They, like most Yashar or ancient Israelites nationally, were scattered to the outskirts of the cities, and only the wealthy could afford to live there, which were typically Herodians, but mostly Idumeans in general. This is the dynamic of the wealthy living in the cities centered with the working poor living on the outskirts is still functioning today. Go look at cities like New York and DC, gentrification in general. The wealthy take over the city, they push the poor to the outskirts. Still in play. And just as we said earlier, this was the wicked priest meeting his just end, and this is reflected in the Qumran corpus as well. Primary source, Dead Sea Scrolls, Habakkuk Pesher. This refers to the wicked priest because of the crime he committed against the teacher of righteousness, that's Yaakov Sadiq, and the members of his party, they're your Ebionites or your Essenes. Elohim handed him over to his enemies, humiliating him with a consuming affliction with despair, because he had condemned the chosen. The chosen were the people selected to bring in the New Testament that we already covered in the previous videos. This was the men of war betraying the liar and the wicked priest and destroying them in the DSS, as we have already shown. We know these men of war, who were Idumean zealots, became known as Sicarii because Josephus plainly informs the reader in his later work called Antiquities, and dates the incident which the zealots were caught in prisoner exchanges began during the period of Albinus, who was the Roman procurator of Judea from 61 CE to 64 CE. Primary source, Antiquities 29:2. Concerning Albinus, under whose procuratorship Jacob or James was slain, as also what edifices were built by Agrippa. 202 reads, but now the Sicarii went into the city by night. That's the first time Sicarii has ever been used historically, coined by Josephus, used to describe the assassins. Just before the festival, which was now at hand, and took the scribe belonging to the governor of the temple. After which they sent to Canaan or Ananias and said that they would send the scribe to him if he would persuade Albinus to release 10 of their party. Again, they were being held captive on the Temple Mount. They were trying to do a prisoner exchange. This was the beginning of greater calamities, for the robbers, meaning the Sicarii, perpetually contrived to catch some of Canaan's or Ananias' servants. And when they had taken them alive, they would not let them go till they thereby some of their own Sicarii. So we see, as I stated, there's your earliest record of the term Sicarii. Sicarii were the Idumea or Idumean robbers who were associated with the zealots, which was a broad term Josephus applied in the 70s when he was in his 30s. But he later made a distinction between the two factions within the zealot innovators, which were the sect of the Nazarenes, and the Sicarii, later in his writings. The Sicarii were a banded group of bloodthirsty Edomites that were originally associated with the Nazarenes, but split after the murder of Jacob Siddiq, or James the Just, and the start of the war with the Romans when Shamma'un Niger, who was yet another brother of Yahusha, took over as Mabakar, or bishop, and took everyone to Pella in Pereira, or the Ebonite-friendly Arabian territory ruled by King Aretas in 66 CE that we covered in Section B. The Sicarii even killed Shamma'un Niger later, probably for what they perceived as deserting their fight against Rome, but again, we can only speculate. Our primary source for this is Wars 461-359. Nor did Niger of Pereira, that is Shamma'un Niger, that's who he's called. Acts 13:1, he was also called Niger or nigger. It just means the black. He escaped, he didn't even escape there, meaning Sicarii hands. He had been a man of great valor in their war with the Romans, but was now drawn through the middle of the city, and as he went, cried out and showed the scars from his wounds. We have here the last Mabakar or bishop from the house of Yahusha called Hamashiach falling to the Edomites. Paul or Tarsus or Saul, whatever you want to designate him, is not recorded anywhere else in Josephus, and it is recorded by him that all of those of the high priesthood and royal house were pretty much slaughtered. This is why the Romans came down and killed everyone and burned the temple. It all started over the killing of Jacob Siddiq. But in reality, it started with the taxing of Palestine by Augustus Caesar in 6 CE that led to a chain of events where a once illustrious nation is all but forgotten and replaced by Herodians today. The ugly truth is, the only faith system that survived from the region were the ones that Roman approved. The only version of Messianism or belief in a Hamashiach was the Edomite Pauline Christianity version, and the only version of Torah faith allowed was the Edomite Judaism version. Both were extremely friendly to Rome, and both forsook the ancient ways for expediency. This concludes the time period of Paul's travels to Palestine, and we even included the time period of Rome. What we hope the viewer takes away from this is this. This is not about regions. This is not even about Yashra'al or ancient Israel. This is about historical truth, first and foremost. And it is the most important thing for anyone, especially those of us who believe we are awakened and on a path of righteousness and seeking the kingdom of Yah. This is about obedience to the Most High Yah. The mighty men of this world have allied with Hasatan and taken over in this age and are using sorcery on the world to control the masses. One of the greatest tools they use is the same one Shaitan uses, lies. Just as in the case of Hasatan and his demons, the use of lies wrapped in truth are very effective tools for the manipulation and control of the masses. We see this in Basarah of Yachanan, or the Gospel of John 8:44. You are of your father, the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. These wealthy men do what they always done. They create a dichotomy or a conflict of two opposing sides by feeding them both lies and having them argue over which is true. Red versus blue, Coke versus Pepsi, Redskins versus Cowboys, Republicans versus Democrats, and on and on and on. Many of us spend a tremendous amount of time and energy arguing over the specifics of a particular verse or the pronunciation of a particular word, but lose sight of the simple truth. What if the book you're arguing over has been corrupted? That makes all such efforts futile. The NT says that truth is freedom, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I personally believe this without fail. However, there's a core principle here missed by most. The truth can only free you if you know what the lies are that bind you. Please understand that there are no pristine or perfect documents available today. We're not telling people that such documents exist, nor are we telling people not to read the Bible. We are merely providing historical truth to battle the Roman lies. All the texts are corrupted in some way, shape, or fashion, and the best way to settle on these matters is to read it all and use the method of 2 to 3 witnesses to validate your positions and let what is true formulate your beliefs instead of allowing what your beliefs are to formulate what is your truth. Read that again, or listen to that again if you have to. You have to make what is true based off of what is real, what is factual, what you can prove. You cannot make your beliefs formulate your truth. If you do not apply this process given by Torah, then you will be buried under the layers of religious lies that have been dumped over the truth for the ages. All primary and necessary secondary sources were provided. And as always, we do not suggest that anyone take our word for anything, but read the information and validate all things for yourselves. And most importantly, pray and seek the Most High Yah on these matters for wisdom. Please feel free to provide any feedback in the comment section. Shalom.